In the first two videos of our series, The 100 Days War, we have witnessed two battles, the Battle of Ligny and the Battle of Quatre, that took place side by side on the 16th of June, 1815. At Ligny, the French right wing and the centre, under the command of Napoleon, pushed back the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher. However, the French victory was not decisive, and the Prussians, although defeated, were not broken. At Quatre, the French left column under Marshal Ney attacked the Dutch forces stationed at the crossroads. Owing to stubborn Dutch and Belgian resistance, the Marshal failed to take the crossroads. The timely arrival of Wellington with reinforcements turned the tables, and the French left column tactically retreated back towards Ligny. However, Ney's engagement with the Allied forces at Quatre prevented the Anglo-Dutch forces from reinforcing the Prussians at Ligny. The next day, Napoleon gave Marshal Grouchy the command of Vandam's and Gérard's corps and sent in pursuit of the retreating Prussians. The Emperor then marched the remainder of his forces towards Quatre. Learning of the Prussian retreat, Wellington withdrew the Anglo-Dutch forces towards the village of Waterloo. Around 4 p.m., the cavalry from the French vanguard came in contact with the Allied rearguard. The 2nd Light Cavalry Lancers Regiment of the Imperial Guard in the French vanguard overpowered a squadron of the 7th British Hussars within the confines of Genappe. The Earl of Uxbridge then ordered the 1st Life Guards of the Household Brigade to charge at the Red Lancers. The household troops galloped down the slope and threw the elite French Lancers into confusion. The Allied cavalry was able to push back the French vanguard. They retreated towards their main columns as more and more French troops poured in. Finally, the two forces deployed on the heights of Mont Saint-Jean. Napoleon reached the inn of La Belle Alliance and sent forward the cuirassiers under Milhaud, along with the artillery of the Imperial Guards. However, the advance of these troops was countered by a violent cannonade from the Allied guns. The Emperor was delighted, for he knew that this meant the Duke of Wellington was not retiring further under the cover of darkness. The order was therefore given for the French to halt and bivouac for the night. It had been a desperately hot day, and the troops on both sides had been tormented by heat. But at about 6 p.m., the heavens opened, and a torrential downpour commenced. A fierce artillery exchange continued between the two armies in the midst of the thunder and lightning. Wellington retired to Waterloo and established it his headquarters. It was here where Wellington received the confirmation from the Prussians that they will join him at Mont Saint-Jean. After the Prussians retreated from Ligny, the Prussian leaders retired the army along a parallel course to the Anglo-Dutch forces. At 5 a.m., Napoleon reconnoitred the battlefield and found that the Anglo-Dutch army had maintained its position. The Emperor thus dictated an order for the French army to be ready for battle at 9 a.m. But the mud on the battlefield compelled Napoleon to delay the attack till 1 p.m. The rain had slowed down the movement of the French baggage train. Although the guns and soldiers had reached Mont Saint-Jean the previous day, a lot of their ammunition was still at Quatre on the road to Waterloo.
Moving on to Waterloo. Just before the commencement of the battle, the 2nd Corps under Quatre took position in front of Hougomont. About 19,000 combined troops of the 2nd Corps was fielded. Compière's cavalry protected the extreme left. Prince Jérôme Bonaparte's division and Confroy's division formed directly in front of Hougomont. Next to them was Bachelu's division. The 7th Infantry Division under Gérard was attached with Vandam's 3rd Corps at Ligny, and henceforth was in pursuit of the Prussians. The 7th Division, with about 4,600 men, were therefore absent from Waterloo. Behind the 2nd Corps were stationed the heavy cavalry under Kellermann, numbering around 2,000, and the heavy cavalry of the Imperial Guards under Guillot. They numbered around 1,900. To the right of Foy's division and left of the farm of La Belle Alliance, the 4 divisions of d'Erlon's 1st Corps were deployed. To the right of Main Road, all along the ridge to the farmhouse of Papillot. This counted to a staggering 18,000 infantry. They were supported by the light cavalry under Jacquinot, numbering around 860 troops deployed to the extreme right. Just behind d'Erlon's corps, the cuirassiers under Milhaud were deployed, numbering around 3,000. About 1,900 troops of the light cavalry of the Imperial Guard was positioned behind Milhaud, next to an artillery battery. The light cavalry under the command of Subervie and Daumont was positioned in the centre, a few yards behind La Belle Alliance. This numbered around 2,700. About 10,000 infantry of Conlobeau's 6th Corps was positioned right next to the farmhouse. The infantry and the artillery of the Imperial Guard Corps were stationed in front of the village of Ossomme and to the right of Plancenoit. The young guards numbered around 4,500 men, and the old guards and the middle guards together numbered around 9,000. Thus, there were roughly 72,000 to 73,000 French troops, of which about 50,000 were infantry, 15,000 were cavalry, and about 8,000 were gunners and engineers, manning 250 guns. At the Battle of Waterloo, there were some 31,000 British soldiers, including the 5,000 troops belonging to King's German Legion. The Dutch/Belgians and Nassauers numbered a staggering 21,000. 11,000 Hanoverians and some 5,000 Brunswick troops added to the strength of the Allied army under the Duke of Wellington. From his point of view, the Anglo-Dutch lines stretched from Braine-l'Alleud on the right to the farmhouse of Papillot on the left. Chassey's 3rd Netherlands Infantry Division was stationed at the heights near Braine-l'Alleud. To its left, troops from Lord Rowland Hill's 2nd Corps guarded the ridge in front of Merbe-Braun, with regiments of H. Halkett's 3rd Hanoverian Brigade and Adams' 3rd British Infantry Brigade. Duplat's brigade of King's German Legion and Adams' 3rd British Infantry Brigade was deployed next to the road to Nivelles. This was done to ease troops' mobilisation during the course of battle. To the very front, Mitchell's 4th British Infantry Brigade occupied the ridge. Further to the back, the Brunswick Corps was held in reserve. On the section of the ridge that stretched from the rear of Hougoumont to that of La Haye-Sainte, the troops from the 1st Corps under the Prince of Orange were deployed as shown. To Wellington's right and nearest to Hougoumont was stationed Byng's brigade, consisting of the Coldstream Guards and the 3rd Foot Guards. Next to them were the 2 battalions of 1st Foot Guards under Maitland. To their left were the men from Halkett's brigade, consisting of the Cambridgeshire, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire regiments and the 73rd Regiments of Foot. Then, the 1st Hanoverian Brigade under Kielmansegg occupied the ridge. A few yards behind them were the 3 battalions of von Kreuser's 1st Nassau Infantry Regiment. Finally, the 2nd Brigade of King's German Legion was positioned to the north of La Haye-Sainte. The infantry on the ridge concealed the cavalry deployed right behind the lines for support. The Household Cavalry Brigade under Lord Somerset was deployed right next to the road. To their rear was positioned Tripp's Dutch Heavy Cavalry Brigade, right of whom stood the 2nd Dutch Light Cavalry under Van Merlen. Aranschalt's 7th British Cavalry was deployed next to them. The 3rd British Cavalry under Dornberg was positioned behind Halkett's brigade, and finally Grant's 5th British Cavalry took position behind the Coldstream and the 3rd Foot Guards near the road to Nivelles. On the left side of the road to Charleroi, Dutch, Belgian, Highlander and Hanoverian troops were deployed along the section of the ridge that stretched from La Haye-Sainte to Papillot. Byland's 1st Netherlands Infantry Brigade and Best's 4th Hanoverian Brigade formed the front line along the ridge. Behind them were the famed Highland troops of Kempt's and Pack's brigades under Picton's reserve infantry. On the extreme left was Vinker's 5th Hanoverians. Sir William Ponsonby's Union Brigade was positioned behind the Highland troops. Vandeleurs' 4th Cavalry was positioned next to the Hanoverians. Vivian's 6th Cavalry formed at the extreme left. De Guigny's 1st Light Cavalry was positioned behind the Union Brigade, and Lambert's 10th British Infantry Brigade was all the way at the back. The defence of the farmhouse of Papillot was to be seen by Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. The 28th Regiment of Orange-Nassau was garrisoned into the fortified farmhouse. Hougomont and La Haye-Sainte were also fortified and garrisoned by various detachments of regiments and brigades. About 400 men of the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion of the King's German Legion were garrisoned at La Haye-Sainte. The farmhouse of Hougomont was a large property comprising of a 3-storied house and a number of outbuildings. The estate included a small forest towards the French deployment and an apple orchard to the opposite side. Wellington ordered 4 light companies of foot guards moved there. The light company of the Coldstream Guards was stationed inside the building. The building was fortified with whatever materials that could be gathered, and a rudimentary platform was constructed as a firing step behind a high section of the wall. The various entrances were barricaded except for the one facing the Allied lines. The reserve ammunition was stored in one of the lower rooms. At 9 a.m., Wellington ordered the garrison at Hougomont to be reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Nassau-Usingen Regiment under the command of Busken. The Grenadier Company of the regiment occupied the building, and the other 2 companies moved into the formal garden. The Voltigeurs were sent to the woods near the Brunswick avant-garde, and the Fusiliers were in the orchard. 2 light companies of the Coldstream and the 3rd Foot Guards were moved westwards towards the narrow kitchen garden. The other 2 companies were called back to their battalion on the heights above.
At 11 a.m., Marshal Ney ordered Quatre to begin the assault. Jérôme Bonaparte's division and Comte Foix's division thus advanced towards the farmhouse. Comte Pile's cavalry guarded the infantry movement from the left. As the French came within range, the Allied batteries stationed on the heights above the farm open-fired and tore through the French lines. The French advance was halted, and a cloud of skirmishers supported by closed columns then advanced against the woods. The Brunswick and Nassau-Usingen troops open-fired. The French forced an entry on the southern boundary of the estate, and huge struggle broke out. The defenders of that section were pushed back into the farm. The Nassau-Usingen troops had to fall back into the building or towards the main lines before they rallied. The Duke saw this and dispatched 4 companies of foot guards and a detachment of Hanoverian brigade to reinforce the garrison. The French advanced within 30 yards of the building. A devastating volley from the Nassau-Usingen troops from inside the building greeted them. The 2 companies of foot guards positioned to the west on the kitchen garden pressed in, only to be seeking cover from the precise shots of the French skirmishers. A battery of howitzers was sent for aid. Spherical shots were shot into the small wood. Supported by artillery, the Allied troops of Hougomont advanced along with the Hanoverian and foot guard reinforcements. The French were pushed back from the front of the building. An attempt was made to attack the building from the rear, but the foot guards resisted with utmost vigor. Increasingly outnumbered, the guards fell back towards the gates leading to the northern courtyard while firing at the French. They shut the gates and attempted to barricade it from inside, but amidst the chaos, the vanguard of the 1st Regiment of Lights succeeded in forcing the gates open and burst into the courtyard. Seeing this, a number of guards ran into the chateau for safety and alarmed all of the defenders. Shots were rained on the poor Frenchmen from all the windows and outhouses, and they were all killed before they could be reinforced. The credit goes to Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonnell and Corporal James Graham of the Coldstream Guards. As the gates were closed almost immediately, the French vanguard ventured into the compound. This act was pivotal in the continued maintenance of the farm and the success of the Allied defense. Rey's and Kellerman's batteries kept firing. A British officer wrote that one of the French batteries was committing great devastation amongst our troops in and near Hougomont. The Allied infantry suffered a steady attrition that gradually began to wear on the men's nerves. The fire of the French artillery distracted many British gunners. Instead of targeting the French columns, they got involved in counter-battery fire. Wellington had expressly forbade it, but it was ignored. Several years earlier, Napoleon, himself a gunner, explained this process. When gunners are under attack from an enemy battery, they can never be made to fire on massed infantry. It's natural cowardice, the violent instinct of self-preservation. The British cannonballs, however, were also hitting the French infantry and cavalry. Some battalions of Rey's Second Corps remained stretched out on the ground in hollows and sunken lanes. Major Lemonnier de la Fosse, ADC to General Foy, writes, "Behind us in reserve was the brigade of Carabiniers, on which the cannonballs which passed over us went to fall. To get out of their range, this brigade moved to their left, which provoked General Foy to laugh. 'Ha! The big boots don't like the rough stuff.'" The heavy skirmish fire and artillery bombardment continued to the last minutes of the Battle of Waterloo. Several sources claim that by the end of the day, the entire French Second Corps had been sucked into the struggle for Hougomont, while the attack at Hougomont was in full swing. At 1 p.m., conquest for the center began. The French artillery open-fired at the Allied positions. The troops of Wellington's left became aware of French troops moving in front of their lines. D'Erlon's First Corps was made out of 4 infantry divisions. On D'Erlon's left was Keogh's division, to their right was Donzelot's and Marconnier's divisions, and on the far right was Duret's infantry division. They were tasked with the attack of Wellington's left flank and break through the Allied army. Riding at the front of the 4 divisions was Marshal Ney and General D'Erlon with their staff. Defending against D'Erlon's corps of 18,000 men was Bylandt's brigade on the front line, comprising of the Dutch and Belgians. The British 5th Division, under the command of Picton, was positioned behind them, and the Hanoverians held the extreme left. But the 2 flanking divisions were in danger because of the Allied troops defending La Haye-Saint and Papilloux. Half of Keogh's division was therefore ordered to take La Haye-Saint, which was defended by some 400 King's German Legion troops, while Duret would send half of his division to take Papilloux, which was defended by 2 Nassau battalions. As the French cannonade continued to soften up the Allied positions, at around 2 p.m., D'Erlon's corps approached the ridge. On the Allied right, artillery fire, together with the rifle fires from the 95th, poured on D'Erlon's left, but was not enough to halt their advance. The French came in contact with right wing of Bylandt's brigade, and volleys were exchanged. However, the morale of Bylandt's brigade was low, as it had already lost 25% of their strength at the Battle of Quatre, 2 days before the Battle of Waterloo. Overwhelmed by the massive French assault, the right wing of Bylandt's brigade quickly broke and fell back. Thomas Picton was ordered to hold the line, and thereby he ordered his Highlanders from Kempt's and Pack's brigade to advance. Kempt's brigade fired upon the incoming French, followed rapidly by a bayonet charge ordered by Picton, who, after ordering the charge, was hit by a musket ball and died instantly. Keogh's divisions was slowly falling back until Kempt's brigade was charged by French cuirassiers from Dubieux. In the center, the French saw the Dutch infantry break and cheered, thinking that the battle has been won. But the left wing of Bylandt's brigade did not break and poured heavy musket fire into the upcoming French. However, the sheer number of the French was sufficient to push the Dutch forces back. Thus, only a thin red line of British troops from Pack's brigade, together with some men from Bylandt's brigade, defended the ridge, and it was clear that the Allied infantry would not be able to hold the ridge for much longer. The Earl of Uxbridge saw the situation and already moved up his British heavy cavalry for a charge against d'Erlon's First Corps. After the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade got into position, the order to charge was given. The Union Brigade charged d'Erlon's infantry, who didn't know that the cavalry was charging until it was too late. Kempt's, Pack's and Bylandt's infantry joined the counterattack. D'Erlon's men broke, ran away, surrendered or got killed. Only Duret's division on d'Erlon's right flank was able to form square to repel the cavalry attack, but soon after also fell back. D'Erlon's attack has failed with a lot of dead and wounded, and with more than 2,000 French soldiers being taken prisoner. With the Household Brigade clashed with Dubiot's cuirassiers, quickly routing them. Ponsonby's Union Brigade charged the French infantry and routed them, capturing an Eagle standard. Having taken casualties from Durut's division and French cannonade, and still trying to reorder themselves, the Scots Greys and the rest of the Union Brigade found themselves before the main French lines. Their horses were blown, and they were still in disorder, without any idea of what their next collective objective was. Some attacked nearby gun batteries of the Grand Battery, dispersing or sabring the gunners. Colonel Hamilton was last seen during the charge, leading a party of Scots Greys towards the French artillery. The Scots Greys and the rest of the British heavy cavalry were taken by surprise by the countercharge of Mihail's cuirassiers, joined by lancers from Baron Jacquino's 1st Cavalry Division. As Ponsonby tried to rally his men against the French cuirassiers, he was attacked by Jacquino's lancers and captured and executed. De Guigny's Dutch-Belgian Light Cavalry Brigade and Vandeleur's Cavalry Brigade came to the rescue of the Union Brigade, charging Jacquino's lancers. What was followed by both sides retreating back to their lines. In all, the Scots Greys suffered 104 dead and 97 wounded, and lost 228 of the 416 horses. But this could be much worse if it wasn't for de Guigny's and Vandeleur's light cavalry brigades. De Guigny's brigade lost a total of 49% of its fighting strength in these engagements. During d'Erlon's assault, Keogh's division was diverted to attack the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. The 1st Regiment of Sapeurs led the attack upon the farm by storming the barricade that was installed on the high road and forced the Allied troops defending the orchard and adjacent sandpit to retire. The 54th and 55th Regiments of Line followed the assault. The French managed to surround La Haye-Sainte despite taking heavy casualties from the garrison. Although the defense of the farmhouse was hanging by a thread, the destruction of d'Erlon's forces to the right by the charge of the Union Brigade relieved the pressure on the fortress farm. During d'Erlon's attack, half of Duret's infantry division was tasked with the assault of the farmhouse of Papillot. Papillot was defended by 2 battalions of 28th Regiment of Orange Nassau under the command of Prince Bernard of Saxe-Weimar. But as the main French attack faltered, the troops attacking Papillot came under the combined attack of Allied infantry and cavalry and were pushed back towards the French cannons. Around 3 p.m., a lull in the fighting is followed by a fierce artillery exchange. This forced Baron Becheloux to move with his 5th Division closer to the orchard at Hougoumont. However, Bechelou's 5th Division never reached neither Hougomont nor the Allied positions between Hougomont and La Haye-Sainte because their advance was driven back by the weight of artillery fire from the combined Allies' batteries on the ridge. Meanwhile, a renewed French assault was being prepared. Nearly 10,000 fresh troops from Georges Mouton, Comte de Lobau's 6th Corps, were set to join the remnants of Comte d'Erlon's corps in another attack against the Allied left flank. Had this assault been executed properly, Wellington could have been finished. His forces on the left were less concentrated and significantly weaker. Another attack on the scale of d'Erlon's earlier assault might have shattered Wellington's left wing completely. His only remaining option would have been to retreat, pulling away from the Prussians and abandoning any hope of coordinated action. But where were the Prussians? Just when Wellington needed them most, silhouetted figures appeared on the eastern horizon. At first, some believed they were the advance elements of Emmanuel de Grouchy's 30,000-man French column. But it soon became clear that these troops wore the distinctive black uniforms of the Prussian army. It was von Blücher's column. The stubborn old Prussian prince had kept his word. As a result, Napoleon Bonaparte was forced to abandon the planned second assault against Wellington's line. Instead, he ordered Lobau's 6th Corps to turn east and engage the advancing Prussians. By around 3 p.m., Lobau's corps began moving towards the southeast, between the farm of Papillot and the village of Plassanois. Napoleon made sure that the rest of the army did not know about the arrival of the Prussians, and thereby tasked Lobau to delay the Prussian advance as much as he could. As the Prussians closed in from the east, Marshal Ney unleashed one of the greatest cavalry assaults of the Napoleonic era. What began as a limited advance by a handful of squadrons soon escalated beyond its original purpose. Around 4 p.m., as the fierce French cannonade continued to unleash hell upon the Allied position, Marshal Ney gathered 2 of the beleaguered brigades from d'Erlon's corps and renewed the attack on La Haye-Sainte. The attempts to carry the farm were stubbornly resisted. It was just then when an aides-de-camp distinguished a retrograde movement in the Allied lines and misinterpreted as a general retreat. The information was sent to Ney, who immediately called for riders to exploit the perceived weakness. In fact, the Allied movement was the result of a direct order from the Duke of Wellington. The Duke wanted the army to retire 100 paces in a conscious effort to reduce the deadly effect of the French artillery bombardment. Delort's entire cuirassier division was committed. So was Watier's. The light cavalry division of the Imperial Guards was ordered to advance along with the cuirassier by Ney, with the words, "Forward, this is the salvation of France." The 2 cavalry divisions crossed the high road to Brussels and formed in the hollow ground close to the farm of La Haye-Sainte. The cuirassiers were in front, the squadrons at quarter distance, with the regiments in column, an echelon from the right. Ney ordered the charge and took his customary position at the head of the troops. As the horsemen ascended the slope, the Allied artillery assailed the cavalry by close-range canister fire that tore through the ranks, but the guns were soon abandoned as the French drew closer. The artillery crew fled to seek shelter in the nearest infantry squares. Yes, squares. To the surprise of Marshal Ney, the Allies were ready to greet the French with 2 rows of infantry squares, formed expediently at an offset, which allowed each square to fire at the enemy without inflicting casualties upon the adjacent formation. Their destructive fire was unleashed upon the French horsemen as they drew closer. Swathes of riders, together with their mounts, were cut down by the deadly fire. The cavalry began to lose heart as they could barely make any impression upon the squares. But Ney harangued them, calling the officers by their name. Ney, instead of calling off the futile assault, sent word to Kellerman and ordered the 11th Cavalry Division to be committed. Thus, more French cuirassiers and dragoons joined the suicide assault. This went on for more than 2 hours. The series of charges were repeated, but to no avail as each attack was repelled by the fire from the squares. While the French cavalry was engaged in its futile attempt to break the Allied squares and secure the heights, the garrison at La Haye-Sainte was running perilously low on ammunition. Repeated requests for more stocks were sent to the Allied lines, but the charging French cavalry in between them made resupply impossible. However, reinforcement in the form of another 3 light companies of King's German Legion and 200 men of the Nassau-Usigen Regiment arrived. However, by 6 p.m., even the reinforced troops went low on ammunition, defending against d'Erlon's troops. The French cavalry kept cycling the charges. In one of the brief intervals between charges, Baron Ompteda was tasked with reinforcing the farmhouse with the 5th Line Battalion. This meant that the battalion had to change from squares to lines and advance towards the farm, making them extremely vulnerable to cavalry charge. Whatsoever, orders are orders, and the gallant Ompteda rode forward on his horse, along with his battalion. They were all charged by a body of French cuirassiers, and Ompteda fell in the struggle. The men were routed, and they seek refuge in the nearest squares. Shortly after, the defense of La Haye-Sainte failed, as the garrison ran out of ammunition and were forced to retreat to the heights, leaving the farmhouse in French hands. Tripp's heavy and Van Merlin's light brigades was initially placed astride the Nivelle road. But when Tripp noticed the French preparations for Marshal Ney's great cavalry assault, he and Van Merlin repositioned their brigades to counter that attack to a position southwest of Mont Saint-Jean. When Ney attacked, the British artillery under Tripp's brigade joined Lord Edward Somerset's Household Brigade in its counterattack. Both the French cuirassiers and the Dutch-Belgian carabiniers charged. The French horses were already tired from their previous exertions and therefore could not make sufficient speed. Tripp's carabiniers shattered their formation through the sheer impact of their assault. This caused a rout of the left wing of the French cuirassiers, which was exploited by other Allied cavalry units. During this encounter, Tripp's brigade suffered severe casualties, and Van Merlin was hit by a cannonball and would die 2 hours later. Despite these casualties, the brigade soon had to renew its attacks. The 2nd Belgian Regiment was led by the Prince of Orange personally in a charge, where he encouraged them with the cry, "Come on, comrades, let's put our sabres to these Frenchmen. The victory is ours." The brigade again routed the opposing cavalry and pursued them past the road to Ohain. Van Merlin would die 2 hours later. By 6 p.m., the French cavalry had sustained such appalling losses that there was little chance of their breaking the Allied squares on the plateau without the support from infantry. Ney belatedly called upon Comte Ray to send elements of 2nd Corps forwards in an attempt to carry the heights. Foix and Bechelou's division tried to advance, but their advance was resisted by the troops present in the compound of Hougoumont. Wellington advanced Adams' 3rd British Infantry Brigade to march along the road to Nivelle. 4 battalions of King German Legion Brigade under Duplat was advanced to the crest of the ridge and down into the valley to stall the French infantry advance. They were accompanied by a battery of horse artillery. A gruesome fight broke out where infantry and cavalry clashed and troops on both sides took casualties. A second attack from Duret's division started at around 6 p.m., with the 2 Nassau battalions being in a desperate situation because of the amount of men they have lost in the last attack. La Haye-Sainte was already in French hands, but Papelotte needed to be taken because of the incoming Prussian reinforcements. Duret's men stormed into Papelotte and pushed the 2 Nassau battalions back to their 2nd line of defense. But after desperate fighting, the French soldiers were tired, wet from the rain from that night, and demoralized by the incoming Prussians. The Prince's Nassauers attacked on their turn and took back Papelotte. But after losing so much men, the Nassau infantry did not have enough to garrison Papelotte and were finally driven out by a 3rd attack from Dulet's division. But at that point, it was too late. The Prussian reinforcements arrived while the Nassauers and French were still fighting. The French soldiers, remembering Napoleon's announcement that Grouchy arrived, did not fire on the Prussians, thinking they were French. The French realized their mistake only after the Prussians fired at them. The French were then quickly driven away from Papelotte at bayonet point. At 5 p.m., the Prussian artillery open-fired on the village of Plancenoit, followed by the advance of the 16th Infantry Brigade. But they were driven back by a counterattack by the French Young Guards. At about 6:30 p.m., the vanguard of the 1st Prussian Corps under Zieten arrived near Smohain and were directed towards Papelotte. The northern part of Papelotte was still under the 2nd Nassau-Usingen Regiment. However, the southern part was held by the French. The Prussians mistook the Nassau troops for their uniform and fired at the French and Nassau troops alike. The error was soon realized, but several men had already died of friendly fire on both sides. The French were then thrown out of Papelotte by the combined strength of the Nassauers and the Prussians. At Plancenoit, the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Chasseurs Regiment of the Imperial Guards was thrown into the contest, and together with the defending French troops, they pushed the Prussians from the southern half of the village. By 7 p.m., the Prussians committed the 14th Brigade. The French were initially driven back, but at the advent of the 2nd Regiment of Grenadiers of the Imperial Guards, the Prussians were driven back from the village once again. The Guards banished their muskets and expelled the Prussians from the village with the bayonet alone. Fortunately for the Prussians, the cavalry belonging to the 2nd Corps covered the Prussian retreat from Plancenoit. The 8 battalions of Young Guard, numbering some 4,500 men, and 2.5 battalions of the Old Guards, numbering 1,500 men, had been committed to the defense of Plancenoit. Upon occupying La Haye-Sainte, the French brought an artillery battery to within 100 paces of the Allied squares positioned on the heights. An incessant artillery bombardment ensued from either side of the road to Brussels. The Allied centre could not but waver. Sensing the opportunity to break the Allied line at hand, Marshal Ney appealed to the Emperor for support. Yet, Napoleon's hands were tied as he had been deploying more and more troops for the defence of Plancenoit. There were no more reserves left other than the Imperial Guards themselves. Trapped between the Anglo-Dutch and Prussian forces, retreat was not an option for the Emperor. At 7:30 p.m., Napoleon had only 11 battalions of the Old and Middle Guard left in reserve. This includes 1 battalion of the 1st Grenadiers, 1 battalion of the 2nd Grenadiers, 1 battalion of the 1st Chasseurs, and 1 battalion of the 2nd Chasseurs. These were the original Old Guard regiments. It is to be noted here that the term Middle Guard is used in this documentary to represent the 3rd and the 4th Grenadiers and Chasseurs. A separate Middle Guard division did not exist by then. By 1815, the Middle Guards were incorporated, or in other words, promoted to the Old Guards. Therefore, the 2 battalions of the 3rd Grenadiers, 1 battalion of the 4th Grenadiers, 2 battalions of the 3rd Chasseurs, and 2 battalions of the 4th Chasseurs were also included in the Old Guard division. All the Young Guards and the 1st Battalion of 2nd Grenadiers, 1st Battalion of the 2nd Chasseurs, and half a battalion of the 1st Grenadiers were already committed to the defence of Plancenoit. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Chasseurs were kept all the way back at Napoleon's headquarters at Le Caillou, Genappe, with the crucial assignment of guarding the imperial baggage. The Emperor thus chose to commit 10 of his fresh Guard battalion against Wellington's centre, leaving the 1st Grenadiers near La Belle Alliance. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Grenadiers soon joined the 2nd Battalion near La Belle Alliance, having returned from its successful intervention at Plancenoit. Napoleon ordered the Imperial Guards to attack the centre of the Allied line. The attack was to be supported by the remnants of the 1st and 2nd Corps on the flanks. The The battalions of the Imperial Guards formed up southwest of La Belle Alliance and advanced. However, the removal of the Guard Corps from the vicinity of Plancenoit allowed the Prussians to push harder into the village. The battalions of the Imperial Guards were formed in squares and advanced in echelon formation. In an echelon formation, battalions are arranged diagonally. Each battalion is stationed behind and to the right or left of the battalion ahead. Although many sources state that the Guards advanced in columns, the battalions of the Imperial Guard were formed in squares as a preventive measure to repulse the Allied cavalry. There was a possibility of repetition of cavalry counterattack, as it happened during the recent d'Erlon's assault. The Guards wanted to avoid such situation and therefore advanced in square formation. Also, a tightly packed attack square would resemble a column from the front in a smoke-filled battlefield at eventide. To the extreme right of the front line was the 1st Battalion of 3rd Grenadiers of Middle Guards. To their right were a battalion of the 4th Grenadiers of Middle Guards. To their left were 4 battalions of Middle Guard chasseurs ascending the ridge. The second line was also formed in an echelon. The 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Grenadiers of the Middle Guards marched on the left. On their right were the 2 battalions of Old Guard chasseurs, followed by 2nd Grenadiers of Old Guards on the extreme right. Napoleon did not commit the 2 battalions of the 1st Grenadiers of Old Guards on this assault. There were no skirmishers deployed from these battalions. The senior officers rode or walked ahead. Although the order of the attack of the Imperial Guards is quite controversial and varies from historian to historian, I have tried to put together a sequence that made sense to me after going through a few relevant books and papers on this battle. It is to be noted that the whole Guard attack was over in 10 minutes, and its various segments ended in quick succession. Much has been debated regarding the advance of the Imperial Guard, particularly which regiments formed the first wave and which followed in the second. However, there is near universal agreement that one attack was carried out by the Middle Guard chasseurs from the French left, while another involved the 3rd and 4th Grenadiers of the Guard to the right. The exact sequence of these assaults remains disputed. Some historians argue that as much as 10 minutes separated the two attacks. Given the desperate circumstances in which Napoleon found himself, such a delay is entirely plausible. What is clear, however, is that neither assault materially influenced the outcome of the other. Therefore, for the sake of clarity, we shall examine them as 2 separate phases of the Imperial Guard's final advance. Advancing in an echelon, the leading battalions of 3rd and 4th Grenadiers, for whatever reasons, veered slightly to the right while approaching the ridge. This maneuver slowed their approach and thereby put the 4 battalions of Middle Guard chasseurs, the first of the Guards, to come in contact with Wellington's men. Then came the attack of the Middle Guard Grenadiers on the Anglo-Dutch and Germans. This is calculated by relating unit positions with careful research. At last came the counterattack of Wellington's troops on the 2nd echelon of Guards. The 4 battalions of Middle Guard chasseurs headed straight towards the British Foot Guards, who stood up and delivered a devastating volley at close range. The 1st Battalion of the Middle Guard chasseurs was instantly repelled. However, the remaining battalions of the chasseurs deployed in line and volleys were exchanged. Meanwhile, the 3rd and the 4th Grenadiers of Middle Guard found themselves in front of the Allied infantry in black. General de Morvan led the 3rd Grenadiers on a devastating bayonet charge, overthrowing the Brunswickers and capturing British battery of Lloyd. A small section of Guard cavalry that accompanied the infantry took out Cleves' battery. Major Lloyd remained a little too far behind his fleeing men, and a French officer caught up with him and cut him down with his sabre. When the flutter of terror passed through the hearts of the Brunswickers, they fell back in disorder and rallied under the cover and support of Vivian's cavalry brigade. De Morvan's guardsmen then collided with von Kreuser's Nassauers. A violent firefight broke out. The 2nd Battalion, under Major von Neuendorf, was brought up and formed in column. Unfortunately, the Crown Prince was wounded and the 2nd Battalion fell back. In their footsteps went the remaining battalions. Also wounded in this clash, the French General Friant went to tell the Emperor that the middle guard broke through the enemy's first line and that all was well. Pushing forward, de Morvan's grenadiers slightly turned to the left and together with the 4th Grenadiers headed toward the left flank of General Sir Colin Halkett's 5th Brigade. Halkett's battalions had earlier changed formation from squares to 4 deep lines, as per Wellington's orders for his whole front-line infantry prior to the Imperial Guard attack. In the firefight with the Guards, Halkett's brigade was seized with panic. The Guard horse artillery fired with dead precision. Half of Halkett's brigade turned about, and in an indescribable disorder, officers and men mixed, fled in frightful confusion. The mob stampeded for shelter behind the sunken lane of the Ohan roadway. However, the other half maintained order and were determined to stand their ground quite bravely. Witnessing the disruption of the front lines, General Chasse, nicknamed General Bayonet, brought 1 brigade of his 3rd Netherland Infantry Division into the front line at once. Chasse also unmasked his attached battery, which unleashed devastating canister blasts into the French grenadiers. He threw forward General Detmer's 6 battalions of fresh Dutch and Belgian troops at the middle guards. Wildly enthusiastic, drumming and shouting, the Dutch troopers dashed into the fray, cheering, "Long live the House of Orange! Long live the King!" The 3rd and the 4th Grenadiers was greatly surprised at the sight of fresh forces. Already exhausted and then shattered by the heavy casualties from the Dutch artillery fire, they fell back down the slope, hotly pursued by the Dutch Belgians towards La Haye-Sainte. Panic soon spread to d'Erlon's infantry. It is to be noted here that many authors prefer not to dwell on the fact that it was a Dutch-Belgian unit which broke the leading echelon of the Imperial Guard. Later, Chasse bitterly complained to Lord Hill because the Dutch and Belgian troops' exploits were omitted in his report. This protest resulted in Hill writing of their conduct to Wellington. It has been assessed that Ney and Friant were with the Grenadiers, which attacked and momentarily broke the Germans, and Friant had prematurely believed victory was achieved when he went back to Napoleon's forward observation post near La Belle Alliance. Moving on to the next phase, the first echelon of the Middle Guard chasseurs struck General Maitland's 1st British Foot Guards to the west. The British Foot Guards had previously been ordered lie down to avoid the cannon fire. As the Guard chasseurs approached, the British Foot Guards stood up and unleashed a devastating volley. This sudden appearance of the British Guards undoubtedly forced the Guard chasseurs to halt and deploy. A violent firefight ensued, which the British infantry firepower overwhelmingly dominated. The middle guardsmen failed to deploy in proper lines and were hailed by incessant musketry from the Foot Guards deployed on a wide frontage, the effect being very deadly to the middle guards. Many, particularly towards the center and rear of the column, seemed to be turning around. Seeing this, Wellington ordered Maitland's 1st Foot Guards to charge. On their advance, the whole French column turned around and made off. The Foot Guards pursued the chasseurs a short distance, when a sudden false alarm of enemy cavalry caused them to rush back to their start line and reform. At that moment, the 2nd echelon of Middle Guard chasseurs arrived on the spot, and another desperate firefight erupted. Adams' British Light Infantry Brigade, west of Maitland, took the initiative to engage. They advanced and wheeled against the chasseurs. The 4 light infantry battalions, including the 52nd Light Battalion, fired a series of crashing volleys, devastating the French. Simultaneously, the British foot guards unleashed hell upon the chasseurs. Encouraged directly by Wellington, the 52nd Light Infantry, supported by its brigade, attacked the chasseurs as they gave ground and retreated, but still resisting with scattered firing. Hundreds of men were falling, yet the British musketry did not cease. Wellington had concentrated all he had on these elite Frenchmen. Adams' brigade daringly advanced east across the slope of the hill before turning down into the valley and advancing towards the French centre. General Hugh Halkett's Hanoverian brigade supported the advance. Napoleon had earlier set up a second French line of Imperial Guards, comprising the 3 battalions of Old Guard and a single battalion of Middle Guard to act as a tactical support line. They were now attacked by Wellington's counterattack, during which General Vivian's brigade of 3 Hussar regiments made a significant thrust into the French centre. Though largely successful in convincing the French to retreat, one of its attacks against a stubborn Old Guard square was repulsed. A part of the French Guard cavalry attempted to move forward and rescue the Middle Guard, but eventually failed. By 8:30 p.m., Prussian General Zieten broke through the French line near the hamlet of Smohain, with part of his 1st Corps, and Bülow's Prussian 4th Corps alongside Pirch's advancing 2nd Prussian Corps had finally captured Plancenoit. Numerous Prussian cavalry advancing from the Prussians' successes against Napoleon's crushed right flank also appeared in the French centre, where the French army's complete rout was now in effect. The retreat of the Middle Guard now resonated throughout the French line. The men lost any hope of success that day, and many resorted to save their own lives. The 3 Old Guard squares in the forward support line dissolved in the frantic close combat. One square had shrunk to a tiny 2-rank deep triangle. These Old Guard commanders gave orders to fire their final volleys and to break up into small groups. They made their way to the rear and joined the formidable squares formed by 1st Grenadiers. Napoleon and some of his staff took refuge in one of them as darkness fell. The 2 battalions of 1st Grenadier Regiment, the oldest of the Old Guard, took no part in the attacks on Wellington's positions. The 2 squares of the 1st Grenadiers left the battlefield with their characteristic bulldog obstinacy. One square marched on the paved road and the other across the fields. Both moved in perfect order, despite the Prussians and Wellington's troops hammering at them. Napoleon left the square he had sought refuge in at around 9:30 p.m., escorted by some generals and a small escort squadron. One guard battery kept firing methodically, but it stopped neither the enemy nor the fugitives. Wellington narrowly missed being hit. His cavalry general Uxbridge, who was beside, was hit in the leg by a cannon shot, which was later amputated. Wellington and Blücher met on the road south of La Belle Alliance and agreed that the Prussians would continue the pursuit, and the Anglo-Allied forces, having barely endured day-long fierce French assaults, would bivouac for the night. As the roar of the cannons faded, the exhausted Duke of Wellington rode on his faithful horse, Copenhagen, back to his headquarters in the village of Waterloo.
The Battle of Wavre is often discounted in accounts of the Waterloo campaign, with much of the focus being on Grouchy's failure to march to the sound of the guns. It was, however, a significant engagement in its own right, and the Prussian defense enabled the rest of the Prussian army to march to Wellington's aid at Waterloo. The battle took place around the villages of Wavre, Wavre, Berge and Limal. The position is to the east of Waterloo, where the main French forces under Napoleon confronted Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army. The events that took place at Wavre were directly related to certain events that took place on the day of the Battle of Ligny 2 days prior. Blücher's Prussian forces were badly mauled at Ligny on the 16th of June. Feldmarschall Gneisenau took command after Blücher's horse rolled on top of him and incapacitated him for some time during the final assault. Marshal Gneisenau gave orders at the close of the Battle of Ligny for Zieten's 1st and Pirch's 2nd Corps to retreat upon Tilly, and for Thieleman's 3rd Corps to cover the withdrawal until the centre and right were clear of the field. He was then to retire upon Tilly, or should he not be able to make for that point, to retreat upon Gembloux and unite there with the 4th Corps under Bülow. Thielemann and Bülow were then to effect their junction with the main army. The next morning, Thielemann's 3rd Corps began their retreat at first light. However, the French were still slumbering heavily in their bivouacs. Barely any effort was made on the French part to gather information as soon as day broke. This let the Prussians slip away from the deadly grasp of the French. After wasting a lot of precious time, only at 11 AM, Napoleon put Maréchal de Grouchy in command of the third of his army and sent him in pursuit of the Prussians from Ligny. De Grouchy was to prevent the Prussian army from uniting with Wellington's left, but by then it was pretty late and the Prussians had quite a head start. De Grouchy was and had been a brilliant leader of cavalry and a soldier of 20 years war experience, and he had distinguished himself at a lot of battles. He was rightfully given the command of the 4th Corps of Reserve Cavalry, Pajol's, Milhaud's, Exelmans and Kellermans early in June 1815, but after Ligny he was appointed to a higher and more responsible post. Commander of the right wing, charged with the duty of following up the Prussians and preventing them from joining Wellington. De Grouchy, however, was not a fit man for independent command. In spite of his exploits in former days, he had never before exercised such a great responsibility. However, at the time, it was not possible for Napoleon to make an alternative selection, and De Grouchy was the only man available. Also, up to this point, there had been no reason to doubt his capabilities, and it is not fair to criticize the man until his faults have been clearly proved. It must be remembered that mistakes in war are inevitable, and the general who makes no mistakes in war has not waged war for long. The 1/3 of French army which was placed under the command of Maréchal de Grouchy consisted of the 2 French corps that fought at Ligny. It was Vandam's 3rd and Gerard's 4th Corps. D'Este's division was a detachment from Monton-Lobau's 6th Corps and marched under de Grouchy. Pajol's 1st Reserve Cavalry and Exelmans' 2nd Reserve Cavalry were attached to de Grouchy. This totaled roughly 32,000 to 33,000 men and 80 guns. The Prussian rearguard under Thielemann left Saint-Bref between 2 and 4 AM. Pajol and Exelmans prepared their pursuit with cavalry after 4 AM without any information of the route taken by the Prussians. The French infantry remained in their tents. Pajol made his way across to the Namur road under the impression that this was the true line of retreat. But after continuing his march for quite some time and having found no trace of the Prussians, he suspected that he was leading a wild goose chase. Pajol was joined by Tester's division at Saint-Denis and continued marching north. When Exelmans discovered the Prussians resting at Gembloux, he neglected to send back word to de Grouchy immediately, nor did he inform Pajol of his discovery. In spite of having a cavalry force of 3,000 troopers and 12 guns, Exile made no attempt to harass the resting Prussians. At around 11:30 am, de Grouchy received the written orders from Napoleon to pursue the Prussians. He then sent orders to Vandamme to march at once with the 3rd Corps from Saint-Amand to Pointe-de-Jour on the way to Gembloux. De Grouchy had to send an aide-de-camp towards Gembloux to obtain news from Exile. He then went himself to Ligny to give Gerard his orders. Vandamme marched with incredible slowness, which in turn limited the marching speed of Gerard's corps. Vandamme's advance guard did not reach Pointe-de-Jour until 3 p.m. Thielemann was by this time an hour's march beyond Gembloux. The roads were in a very bad state, and the heavy rain that was falling made marching difficult. Also, the passage of the Prussians had made the roads worse, but Pointe-de-Jour is less than 4 miles from Saint-Amand. De Grouchy reached Gembloux at 7 p.m. when he was supposed to be already vigorously pressing the Prussians. De Grouchy decided to halt at Gembloux for the night. There was still 2 hours of daylight left when Vandamme's corps reached the village. Pajol, in the meantime, finding that he was mistaken in his conclusions, marched back from Saint-Denis along the same route, the point from which he had started in the morning. From the scouts dispersed to different locations, Exile at 10 p.m. knew with comparative certainty that the enemy were marching on Wavre, but he did not report anything concrete to de Grouchy. By nightfall of the 17th, while de Grouchy was still at Gembloux, the whole of Blücher's army had reached Wavre and its neighborhood. The 2nd and 3rd Corps bivouacked on the left bank of the Dyle beyond Wavre, and the 1st and 4th on the right bank. Pech was between Sainte-Anne and Aisemont. Ballau was at Dion-le-Mont. The rear guards were posted at Vieux-Sart and Mount Saint-Gilbert. These troops fell back next day as the French advanced. It was only when Blücher had made sure of his concentration and the refilling of his wagons and limbers that he replied to Wellington, "I shall not come with 2 corps only, but with my whole army," upon this understanding, however, that should the French not attack us on the 18th, we shall attack them on the 19th. About midnight of the 17th, a message from Wellington reached Blücher. It ran, "The Anglo-Allied army is posted with its right upon Braine-l'Alleud and its center upon Mont-Saint-Jean, and its left upon the Haye, with the enemy in front." The Duke awaits the attack, but calculates on Prussian support. Gneisenau was very suspicious of the sincerity of Wellington's intentions. He believed that the Duke would fall back at the last moment and involve the Prussian army in a serious disaster. But Blücher had a greater idea of the honor of the words of generals and finally overcome the reluctance of his chief of staff. He thereupon replied to Wellington that Ballow's corps will set off marching tomorrow at daybreak in your direction. It will be immediately followed by the 2nd Corps. The 1st and 3rd Corps will also hold themselves in readiness to proceed towards you. The exhaustion of the troops, part of whom have not yet arrived, does not allow me to commence my movement earlier. An order to this effect was at once sent to Ballau at Dion-le-Mont. The next day, Ballau commenced his march on Dion-le-Mont at daybreak. The safe arrival of Ballau's corps at Saint-Lambert and the reports from his scouts made Blücher resolve to hasten the march of the 1st and 2nd Corps. Blücher himself rode to Saint-Lambert at 11 am. While Pirch's corps was passing through Wavre and Ledebour's detachment retired on the town from Mont Saint-Gilbert, the enemy cavalry appeared in sight. It was Exilman's cavalry. However, the French did not press their advance hard, and at 3 o'clock the Prussians retired across the Dyle. Pirch's corps then continued its march on to Saint-Lambert, leaving Tilleman in defense of Wavre. Let's now move to the French camp on the previous night. Vandamme was ordered to march at 6 AM and Gerard at 8 AM. Now, at that time of the year, it was light enough to march at 3:30 AM. Hence, de Grouchy wasted another valuable 2.5 hours when time was all important. On the morning of June the 18th, 1815, the soldiers of the French right column under de Grouchy were delayed in their march towards Wavre. They had remained bivouac at Gembloux for the last 12 hours, and yet their breakfasts were not ready. After a 2-hour delay, Vandamme's troops started their march at 8 AM. They were followed by Gerard's. De Grouchy himself left Gembloux at 8:30 AM. He overtook Vandamme's corps at Valais at about 10 AM and dismounted for breakfast, allowing the troops to march on. There, de Grouchy was joined by Gerard, who rode ahead of his men. During their breakfast, the sound of heavy firing in the direction of Mont Saint-Jean was heard from the garden of the house where they had stopped. This was the opening cannonade of the Battle of Waterloo, which began at 11:30. Gerard at once urged de Grouchy to change his direction and march to the sound of the cannonade, but de Grouchy refused to take the responsibility of disobeying the orders he had received from Napoleon to pursue and attack the Prussians and on no account to lose sight of them. Having finally received a report from Excelmans from the front a few minutes ago, de Grouchy considered that they were in pursuit of the entire Prussian army and not just of a single corps. Around 2 PM, the Prussian rearguard at Mount Saint-Gilbert came in contact with Vandamme's vanguard. The Prussian rearguard then retreated towards Wavre through the woods, avoiding the French cavalry. By this time, Tilleman had felt that the French would not attack Wavre in force. He judged this owing to the inactivity of Excelmans' cavalry. Tilleman therefore prepared his entire corps, then acting as a rearguard, to march towards Waterloo, leaving only a small detachment as a rearguard at Wavre. The divisions had only started their march when the rearguard from Mount Saint-Gilbert reached Wavre and alerted Tilleman of the imminent French assault. Tilleman then redirected the marching divisions back to Wavre. This was surely a complex maneuver to execute, and the Prussians had done it just right. Vandamme's vanguard started to arrive at Wavre towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the ensuing clash boiled up into the Battle of Wavre. The Prussian defense of Wavre. Tilleman had 3 infantry and 2 cavalry brigades under his command, in addition to 5 batteries of artillery. It was not much, but well posted. Such a force was likely to detain the French for a considerable length of time. The 2 bridges at Wavre were quickly barricaded. Bourke's 9th Division was left stranded on the French side of Wavre. The division moved to the right to Bar Wavre and crossed the bridge and destroyed it before Excelmans' dragoons, positioned at Dion-les-Monts, could capture it and make a crossing. As soon as Vandamme's corps plainly showed signs of attacking, Tilleman immediately halted all his divisions and began to dispose them for defense. Tilleman stretched the Prussians from Bar Wavre to the village of Berger. Sharpshooters and skirmishers were stationed at the riverbank. A mill was situated on the south bank of Berger. Advanced skirmishers occupied this post. 3 battalions under Colonel Zeppelin were stationed at Wavre on the north bank of the Bridge of Christ. They prepared for the coming fight by knocking loopholes in the houses of the north bank adjoining the river. The rest of Tilleman's forces were stationed in the rear of this front line as a reserve. Behind Wavre and Bar Wavre was Slac's 11th Brigade, consisting entirely of inexperienced landwehr troops. Directly behind Wavre, Tilleman had stationed Kampfen's 10th Brigade, while finally Stulpnagel's 12th Brigade was formed in support of the advanced skirmishers in Berger. The Prussian commander's own headquarters were to be found at the Chateau of La Bavette, 2 kilometers to the north of Wavre. Nearby were positioned almost the whole of the Prussian cavalry force under General von Hobe. Hussars, Uhlans, dragoons and Landwehr militia horsemen. Attached to this force were 2 batteries of horse artillery, 16 bronze guns mounted on mud-spattered carriages painted light blue. Further forward were the infantry brigades, each of which had 2 cavalry squadrons and an artillery battery attached to it. Le Male was defended by a small force commanded by Stengel. Those Prussians left in the area were ready for action. Captain Siborn concluded by writing, "Tillemans' position was certainly a very favorable one, and the occupation of it was arranged with great skill. Towards 3 o'clock, French skirmishers were observed by the Prussian on the heights opposite of Wavre. De Grouchy's forces were arriving. Vandam's French 3rd Infantry Corps rolled up in strength between 3 and 4, with green-coated dragoons protecting its right flank at Bas Wavre. 3 batteries were drawn up just south of the town of Wavre and immediately opened fire. Cannonballs soared into the air before plunging into the streets of the town in the valley beneath. One such missile crashed through a window into the church of Saint Jean the Baptist, embedding itself into a stone pillar inside and remaining there to this day. This fire was less of a bombardment and more of a show of strength in support of the first wave of French attackers. Vandam was a hot-headed and fiery general. Hussey rightly commented that he launched his attack without reconnoitering the position or preparing for the action by his artillery, and without waiting for de Grouchy to arrive in person. French skirmishers threaded their way down the slopes to the suburb on the south bank, followed by a whole division commanded by Habert and formed up in heavy assault columns. It is a steep hill, and the French poured down it, and the Prussians quickly evacuated the suburb. The French followed them closely, storming up to the 2 bridges. Both appear to have been strongly barricaded, both to have had a crossfire poured on them from Prussians hidden in loopholed houses on the north bank, and both to have been impassable. The stone bridge of Christ became clogged with bodies. The stone bridge of Christ became clogged with bodies. Hussey mentioned in his account that there were Prussian cannons established at various altitudes up the steep streets leading down to the river. These poured a withering fire on the attackers. The French divisional commander Habert and 600 rank and file were put out of action in a few minutes. The survivors could not advance. The Prussian barrage hitting the slopes behind them meant that they couldn't or wouldn't retreat. De Grouchy, who arrived at that moment, summed the situation up. They were wedged into a kind of cul-de-sac. More French units had now arrived on the battlefield and were committed to the ongoing fight. Excellement's dragoons were in front of Bas Wavre, protecting that flank. Gerard's 2nd Infantry Corps under de Grouchy's command was approaching fast. Another division from the Vandam's Corps, Le Fol's, went into Wavre. Skirmishers of the 2 armies extended along each bank of the Dyle, all along the battlefront from Berger to Bas Wavre. They sniped and reloaded, hid behind trees and hedges. Another French assault on the Bridge of Christ was launched and failed. A battalion was detached from Le Fol's to attempt to cross at Berge. This attack failed too. With the recent storms, the deep, broad ditches running parallel to the River Oil were filled with water between 4 and 6 feet deep. Musket balls fired from behind trees on the northern riverbank whizzed around their heads as the discouraged Frenchmen fell back. It was 5 o'clock. Some time ago, an order had arrived from Napoleon directing de Grouchy to establish operational and liaison contact with the main French force at Waterloo. De Grouchy therefore sent orders to those of his formation still marching towards Wavre to head towards the bridge at Limal upstream from Berge. The securing of a crossing at Limal would result in the opening of a more direct route to Waterloo. Pajol's and Valin's cavalry regiments, together with Tester's infantry division, headed for Limal. Gerard, in a foul temper following recent disagreement with de Grouchy, arrived with another battalion to storm forward. The assault was about to go in when Gerard was hit in the chest by a musket ball and was carried to the rear. Baltus, an artillery general, was next requested by de Grouchy to lead the attack, but he refused. De Grouchy dismounted. The third French assault was hence led by the gallant French Marechal in person, and yet it failed just as gallantly as the other two. It was by now clear that no crossing could be forced at either Berge or Wavre. De Grouchy left Exelmans, Vandamme and Hulot in front of Wavre and Berges respectively, to maintain frontal pressure and detain the Prussian forces in this area. He himself set off with the other two divisions of Gerard to Limal. During the Berges fighting, Vandamme had continued to lead assault waves onto Wavre. 13 separate attacks were made before the conflict gradually flickered out. The action is a superb example of fighting in a built-up area, extremely costly in men and ammunition. One of Vandamme's regiment, the 2nd Swiss, bore distinctive red coats and a tradition of courage. Before the campaign, they had numbered 700. After the repeated and bloody attacks on the Bridge of Christ, they no longer as a unit existed. French troops, Pajol and Valin's cavalry and Tester's infantry division arrived at Limal at around 7 in the evening, together with 3 artillery batteries. The Prussian commander here was Oberstleutnant Stengel, with his force of 3 battalions of the 19th Regiment and 3 cavalry squadrons. No attempt had been made to either barricade or destroy the wooden bridge. There was another factor as well. Stengel's detachment was not part of Thieleman's force, but left behind as a rearguard by Zieten's 1st Corps, which was by now at Waterloo. Stengel thought that his proper post was with Zieten and not at Limal with another corps. This would explain his reluctance to hold on to the bridge and also his marching off to Waterloo later on in the battle. The French General Pajot, on the other hand, was an expert at capturing bridges. He had done so at Montereau in 1814, at Charleroi on the 15th of June of 1815, and now he launched Valin's hussars, chasseurs à cheval, and dragoons at Limal Bridge, which was accessible to only 4 horses at a time. Stengel gave way. Pajol and Teste followed Valin over onto the other side of the Dyle. The French at last had their bridgehead, which compared to Wavre and Berge had come at extremely little cost. Stengel had fallen back. Now Thielemann shifted the whole of the reserve line of his infantry stationed behind Wavre and Berge to the west. This freed Stulpnagel's infantry and Horbe's cavalry to rush southwest towards Limal to plug the hole in the Prussian defense line. De Grouchy was meanwhile marching 2 divisions of Gerard's corps to the Limahl bridgehead along the opposite bank of the Dyle. De Grouchy arrived at the Limahl bridgehead at dusk, towards 9 o'clock, and before the Prussian reinforcements. He organized the dispositions of his forces with great skill. Despite the obscurity of the darkness, he hurried his troops up the heights by a narrow, rugged road. The French line was perpendicular to the Dyle. Light cavalry covered the left flank, while the right consisted of infantry inside the houses of Limahl. The crest of the plateau above the village now became a battleground. Stulpnagel had brought up 6 of his 9 Prussian battalions to support Stengel. They were launched at the French along with the support of 5 cavalry squadrons. The Prussians rushed to reinforce Limahl or to recapture it, but they headed directly towards de Grouchy's trap in the darkness. 2 of Stulpnagel's Prussian battalions were about to pass the holloway when they received a devastating volley from the French on the other side. Their advance was checked. The other 3 battalions of the Prussian brigade inclined too far to the east and were pinned down by French skirmisher fire. Stengel in the west was checked by French cavalry, and since these threatened his right flank, he fell back. Stulpnagel followed suit, leaving only a chain of advanced posts. Thus, the Limahl bridgehead was consolidated and a route was open. But, wrote José, for a long time the Emperor's cannon had ceased to be heard. The Prussians settled down for the night in the woods of Rixensart. The French bivouacked in squares to the south. It was an uneasy night. In the early hours of the 19th of June, Thielemann was unnecessarily weakened and overstretched as a result of Stengel's action. Some unconfirmed news of the victory at Waterloo had reached the Prussian commander, who therefore expected the French to retreat. To hasten them on their way, he renewed the fight at daybreak around 4 o'clock with a cavalry attack by Hob's horsemen. The French, however, displayed no intention of retreating, as no word of the outcome of Waterloo had yet reached their ears. Indeed, the fierce artillery duel which developed resulted in 5 Prussian guns being lost. De Grouchy organized a general offensive on the west bank of the Dyle. 3 columns of attack were organized. The French plowed forward and a Prussian counterattack was thrown back. 22 French battalions grappled with 10 Prussian. 6 more French were in support. Stulpnagel eventually gave way and the French seized part of Rixensart woods. At 8 o'clock, Thielemann was positively informed of the Waterloo victory and that Prussian troops were on the way to cut off de Grouchy's line of retreat. As morale rose, Rixensart's woods were retaken momentarily before the French flooded back in. Tester's column meanwhile had opened an attack on Berger's village. It was a fierce fight. Teste himself was wounded and one of his brigadiers, General Penn, had his head crushed by a Prussian shell before the village finally fell. The fall of Berger was a turning point of the fighting on the 19th of June. This severely weakened the Prussian defense. Thielemann soon after, towards 1 o'clock in the afternoon, ordered a general retreat so as to avoid a crushing defeat, losing 5 cannons and a number of wounded. Colonel Zeppelin pulled out of Wavre and was hardly attacked by Vandam's corps in the process. Later in the day, Vandam started to advance out of the abandoned Wavre. Some French battalions were halted by a rearguard action to the north of the town. Lithe gallantry and steadiness displayed in this affair by the Kermack Landwehr acquired for the latter great and well-merited renown. Thielemann pulled back in several columns to St. Achtenrode via Ottenburg. The French did not pursue fiercely. Soon, indeed, a messenger would arrive, stuttering out a half-incoherent message of the disaster at Waterloo. De Grouchy commenced his retreat to France on the same day. Successfully eluding Prussian forces sent to intercept him, he safely led his troops back to Paris via Namur. At first glance, the Battle of Wavre was a French victory. Traditionally, however, the victor is he who has possession of the battlefield after the fight. The Prussians were the real victors and won the battle on the 18th of June. By the time de Grouchy had opened a route to Waterloo at Limal, he was hours too late to intervene in the battle. Casualties were not excessively heavy. The Prussians suffered around 2,400 and the French 2,600. Wavre may lack strategical importance when compared with the Battle of Waterloo, but it is a magnificent example of Napoleonic battle tactics. In addition, as Sebon commented, it was one of the brightest examples of the defense of a town and of the passage of a river recorded in military history. Nor should Pajot's storming of the Limal Bridge be omitted. That feat of arms perhaps ranks with the capture of Remagen Bridge during the Second World War. In addition, enough relics, monuments and views will be found today at Wavre battlefield to make a visit worthwhile.
Evening fell on Waterloo. The French army, shattered, exhausted and leaderless, began its retreat. Under the fading protection of the Imperial Guard's cavalry, the remnants streamed south, not in order, but in collapse. Yet this was not the end of the war. The French would fight on and even succeed, saving men and equipments, buying time for the Emperor to consolidate and strike. Although events were already slipping beyond the battlefield, into the hands of politicians, can Napoleon turn the tide once more? In our previous videos, we have witnessed Napoleon's dramatic return from exile, his escape from Elba, his march on Paris, and his seizure of power once more. We saw him strike first, defeating the Prussians at Ligny, while the Anglo-Dutch army held firm at Quatre. We followed the campaign to its climax, at Waterloo, where every assault, every decision, and every missed opportunity shaped the fate of Europe. And beyond the main battlefield, at Wavre, you saw Marshal Grouchy engaged, delayed, and ultimately absent when he was needed most. But Waterloo was not the end, because what followed was just as decisive. An army still in the field, a nation not yet defeated, and an emperor facing his final choices. This is the story of what happened next. At La Belle Alliance, the victors made their decision. Wellington and Blücher agreed that the Prussians would pursue the retreating French. The crippled Anglo-Dutch army would rest and tend to its wounded. Command fell to August von Gneisenau. Through the night, Prussian cavalry pressed forward. Columns were already in motion. Friedrich Wilhelm von Bülow advanced on Genappe. Friedrich von Pirch II marched towards Mansart to cut off the French line of retreat. The hunt had begun. As the French Imperial Guards broke at Waterloo, Napoleon took shelter in one of the squares of his old guards. Enemies closed in from all sides. The Emperor was forced to flee as the old guards stood tall, guarding their Emperor's escape one last time. Amid the chaos at Genappe, Napoleon's carriage became trapped, surrounded by fleeing soldiers. For a moment, the Emperor stood on the edge of capture. A Prussian officer is said to have seized his hat, his coat, even his sword. But Napoleon escaped. The man was gone. Only the legend remained in enemy hands. Through the night, the pursuit lost momentum. Exhaustion took hold. South of Frasne, Gneisenau called a halt. By then, 8,000 French had already been taken. The road to France was filling with prisoners. Far to the east, at Wavre, the war had not yet caught up. Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy still marched. Unaware of Napoleon's defeat, Grouchy's men broke the Prussian rearguard formed by Thielmann's Third Corps. At 10:30 in the morning, the truth arrived. Waterloo was lost. Confusion followed. Dominique Vandamme, commander of the 3rd French Corps, urged a bold strike toward Brussels. Free the prisoners and cut off the enemy's supply and retreat. But orders from Marshal Soult were clear. Retreat. Grouchy turned south, toward the Sambre, and embarked on a retreat that is praiseworthy. He might not have been able to save Waterloo, but he might just be able to salvage the Armée du Nord. Namur would be the key. Time was now everything. At 11:30, Grouchy unleashed his cavalry. Rémy Exelmont rode ahead to seize the bridges at Namur. Behind him, the army followed, shielded by a rearguard of cavalry and Test's infantry. For a moment, the path was clear. General Pirch's 2nd Corps was already on the move, marching to cut off Grouchy's line of retreat. By June 19th, they reached Mellery. But Pirch's men were exhausted. Pirch had no choice but to halt. For the rest of the day, the Prussians did not advance. At 1600, French dragoons secured the bridges. By nightfall, the army was streaming through Namur. Grouchy was just 10 kilometers behind. The escape route held.
On the 20th of June, von Pirch's men marched toward Namur. They caught up with the French rearguard. Losing no time, the Prussians launched an attack. But the cautious Grouchy, anticipating Prussian intervention, was prepared. The French threw back the Prussian advance. General Pirch's men struck again and again, but each attack was repulsed. The French rearguard under Test held firm, inflicting heavy losses. 1,500 Prussians fell, and at last the pursuit was called off. The French managed to pass through Namur and evade the Prussian pursuit by setting fire to the only bridge for miles around across the fast-flowing river Meuse. Grouchy's army had escaped. On the 21st of June, Grouchy entered Philippeville. 28,000 men remained under arms. His army was undefeated. His guns were intact. The Army of the North still lived. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st, but here he faced a different enemy, the politicians. The chambers turned against him. Davout, Carnot, and Napoleon's brother Lucien advised Napoleon to dissolve the chambers and to seize power. Others demanded surrender. Napoleon still had 30,000 reliable troops and the loyalty of the lower class. He could have seized power. He could have crushed them all. But he refused. He would not let Paris run with blood. On June 22nd, he abdicated in favor of his son, the King of Rome. Power passed to a provisional government led by Joseph Fouché.
Until then, many soldiers could scarcely imagine that the emperor would abdicate a second time. France had been beaten, but not yet conquered. Emmanuel de Grouchy had already assembled 28,000 men at Laon. The armies still stood in the field, fortresses still flew the tricolour, and thousands remained willing to fight in Napoleon's name. In the southeast, Louis-Gabriel Suchet drove back the Piedmontese. In the Vendée, Jean-Maximilien Lamarque crushed the uprising. France could still fight. But the will to fight was breaking. News of Napoleon's abdication spread through the ranks, and with it, desertion. Then came the invasion. The Anglo-Dutch and Prussians from the north, Austrians from the east, and Italians and Piedmontese from the south. Thousands of Russians on the march. Karl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg, crossed the Rhine with 210,000 men. Along the eastern frontier, fortresses came under siege. Even so, Jean Rapp struck back, defeating Württemberg's advance guard before withdrawing toward Strasbourg. The Battle of La Suffel is itself a tale for another time. From the north, the Allies closed in. The British advanced through Péronne and Montdidier, just 2 days behind the Prussians. Various fragments of the Armée du Nord, along with Grouchy's column, slowed the advance of the Allies while beating a marching retreat. By June 29th, the Armée du Nord entered Paris. Yet even after Napoleon's abdication, the outcome of the campaign remained uncertain. On June 30th, Blücher attacked Paris and failed. He was repulsed, forced to maneuver south, searching for a weaker approach. But Louis-Nicolas Davout was waiting. He tracked every move. For a brief moment, France held the advantage. Davout had more men than either Allied army before him. Minor victories were still possible, which could have summed up to turn the tables. But it would not be taken. On July 1st, General Exelmann's cavalry struck the advancing Prussians at Roccancourt. The French routed several enemy detachments and sending alarm through Allied headquarters. For a fleeting moment, the emperors of Russia and Austria and the King of Prussia found themselves dangerously close to the fighting. With utmost efforts, the coalition troops managed to contain the French, but the incident revealed a startling truth. The fate of post-Napoleonic Europe still hung by a thread. In spite of such heroic acts by the French troops, Marshal Davout, trapped in political intrigue, was forced to choose another path. As Minister of War, he had to act in the interest of the people of France. This time, not to fight, but to end it. For nearly 2 weeks after Napoleon's abdication, France was governed by Joseph Fouché's Executive Commission in the name of Napoleon II. Yet the Allied powers refused to recognize the young emperor. Faced with Allied occupation and political collapse, Fouché negotiated with the coalition and ultimately facilitated the return of Louis XVIII. On July 4th, an armistice was signed. The French army withdrew behind the Loire. Marshal Davout, with his cooperation with the Bourbons and the Allies, hoped to preserve the army. But under Allied pressure, the order came to disband the French army. The resistance faded. France was thus occupied and plundered. Louis XVIII re-entered Paris on the 8th of July 1815. Meanwhile, after his abdication, Napoleon withdrew to Malmaison, not as emperor, but as a prisoner of circumstance. Joseph Fouché now held power. Napoleon asked for a ship to sail to America to seek asylum. Fouché delayed. To him, Napoleon was no longer a ruler, but a bargaining chip. But time was running out for Napoleon. Napoleon very well knew that Blücher wanted him hanged. The British would never set him free. Still, Napoleon offered one last service: to take command as a general to the government, to drive back the invaders, and then leave France forever. Napoleon knew Davout's forces locally outnumbered the Allied columns. That would be the right moment to push. But Fouché refused. At that moment, Napoleon still possessed options. The army remained intact, Paris had not yet fallen, and Davout's forces stood ready to fight. A successful counterstroke, perhaps another campaign like that of 1814, might have bought time, divided the Allies, and reopened possibilities that seemed lost after Waterloo. But this time, he chose not to cast the dice. Napoleon left for Rochefort. Maybe he was too tired to gamble with destiny. On July 3rd, he arrived. A ship awaited him, but the escape did not. British warships sealed the harbor. Napoleon hoped to escape France aboard the frigates Sale and Medusa, and eventually reach the United States. Several French naval officers believed there was a narrow window in which a fast vessel might slip through the British blockade. Contrary winds repeatedly delayed departures from Rochefort. The unfavorable weather made it harder for French ships to leave port and evade British cruisers. Each day of delay allowed the British blockade to tighten. By the time conditions improved, the opportunity for a clean escape had largely disappeared. Friends and supporters proposed desperate alternatives: quiet departures, concealed voyages, one last bid for freedom. But Napoleon turned them down. After 20 years at the center of Europe's stage, he would not leave it as a fugitive. On July 10th, he opened negotiations with Admiral Maitland, the commander of the British squadron Rochefort. On July 14th to 15th, orders issued by Louis XVIII for Napoleon's arrest reached Rochefort. At sunrise, July 15th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped aboard a British warship and surrendered. Not to a general, not to a nation, but to history. With the army gone, the emperor exiled, vengeance followed. The White Terror swept across France. Michel Ney executed. Guillaume Brune murdered by a mob. Joachim Murat, the former king of Naples, shot after his failed attempt to recapture his kingdom. Marshal Soult vanished. General Van Damme left for America. The empire did not end in one battle, but in silence, exile, and blood. Ahead lay Saint Helena, exile, and the final chapter of an extraordinary life.
What happens when the most powerful man in Europe loses everything? For about 2 decades, one man had shaped the destiny of Europe. From a mere artillery officer to crowning himself the Emperor of the French, the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte is extraordinary. Only months earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Kings trembled at his name. Empires rose and fell according to his decisions. But now he stood upon the deck of a British warship, staring into an endless ocean. The Battle of Waterloo had scattered his final hopes. France had abandoned him. Europe had united against him. And his enemies had reached a single conclusion: Napoleon could never be allowed to return a second time. His destination was St. Helena, a tiny island lost in the South Atlantic, a windswept volcanic prison nearly impossible to escape. There, under constant surveillance, the former emperor would spend the last 6 years of his life. This is exactly what we shall look at in this short documentary. Lionsberg's Cinematic History presents The 100 Days War, St. Helena, the final chapter. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon still had one final campaign to wage, not against armies, not against kings, but against history itself. After Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. His immediate hope was escape. America seemed the obvious destination. Several ships waited on the French coast. Yet the British warships blockaded every possible route. As the net tightened around him, Napoleon faced an impossible choice: continue running or surrender. On the 15th of July 1815, he boarded HMS Bellerophon and presented himself to Captain Frederick Maitland. Napoleon believed Britain might grant him asylum. He compared himself to the ancient Greek hero Themistocles, seeking refuge among former enemies. Instead, the British government made another decision. He would not be treated as a guest. He would be detained indefinitely. A prisoner of Europe. A prisoner whose very existence threatened the fragile peace established after 2 decades of total war. On 7th of August 1815, Napoleon was transferred to HMS Northumberland. His destination remained secret. As the ship moved southward through the Atlantic, rumors spread among the passengers. Some suspected an island prison. For more than 2 months, the Northumberland sailed south. As Europe disappeared beyond the horizon, Napoleon spent long hours on deck. Observers noted moments of melancholy, yet he also remained composed. Others imagined a remote British colony. Eventually, the truth emerged. St. Helena. Even Napoleon was stunned. The island occupied one of the most isolated positions on Earth. Towering cliffs guarded its coastline. Strong currents surrounded it. Escape was considered virtually impossible. The British had deliberately chosen a location where no rescue attempt could realistically succeed. Already he seemed to understand that his military career had ended. Another struggle now began. On the 15th of October 1815, St. Helena appeared through the mist. Dark volcanic cliffs rose abruptly from the ocean. The island looked more like a fortress than a colony. The following day Napoleon landed. His small entourage accompanied him. Among them were Grand Marshal Bertrand, General Montholon, General Gourgaud, the valet Marchand, and Count Emmanuel de Lascasse. Together they formed a miniature imperial court in exile. Now, it is to be noted here that Count Emmanuel de Lascasse' Memorial of St. Helena is one of the most famous eyewitness accounts of Napoleon's exile. It is invaluable because Lascasse lived with Napoleon on St. Helena from October 1815 until November 1816 and recorded daily conversations, reflections, routines, political commentary, and personal memories. A significant part of this script is based on Lascasse's account. While preparations were made for Napoleon's permanent residence, the emperor in exile stayed at a small pavilion known as the Briars. There he developed an unexpected friendship with the Balcombe family. For a brief period, the atmosphere was almost pleasant. Young Betsy Balcombe treated the former conqueror with cheerful informality. Napoleon laughed, played games, and enjoyed one of the last genuinely happy episodes of his captivity. Yet this respite would not last. In December 1815, Napoleon moved into Longwood House. The choice had been made for one reason: surveillance. The building stood upon a high plateau where movement could easily be observed. Unfortunately, it was also one of the most unpleasant locations on the island. Wind swept constantly across the uplands. Fog drifted through the rooms. Humidity soaked the walls. The house itself was poorly constructed and frequently damp. Napoleon soon came to hate it. Visitors described leaking roofs, rotting wood, poor ventilation, and a persistent discomfort. The former ruler of Europe now occupied quarters resembling a neglected country house. To Napoleon, Longwood became a symbol of deliberate humiliation. Napoleon refused to behave like an ordinary prisoner. Inside Longwood, imperial etiquette continued. Servants followed ceremonial routines. Formal audiences took place. The household addressed him as emperor. Mules retained elaborate protocols. Titles remained in use. In his own mind, he had lost power, but not legitimacy. Lascasse observed that Napoleon constantly emphasized his distinction. He was no defeated adventurer. He was a sovereign unjustly detained by foreign powers. Every aspect of life became political, even the question of what name British officials used.
Governor Hudson Lowe refused to acknowledge the imperial title.
Official correspondence addressed him merely as Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon considered this a deliberate insult. The dispute escalated into a bitter personal conflict, one that would dominate the remaining years of exile. In April 1816, Sir Hudson Lowe arrived as governor. Relations deteriorated almost immediately. Lowe had been instructed to prevent escape at any cost. He imposed strict regulations. Movement was monitored. Letters were inspected. Visitors were controlled. Night curfews were enforced. Napoleon interpreted every restriction as persecution. Lowe viewed Napoleon as a master manipulator seeking opportunities to escape. Each man distrusted the other completely. Their relationship evolved into a psychological war. Arguments erupted over allowances, travel permissions, titles, correspondence, and security measures. Neither side yielded. The conflict gradually transformed St. Helena into a prison of mutual resentment. Yet exile provided Napoleon with something he had rarely possessed during his years of power: time. Time to reflect, to explain, to shape history. Almost every day, Lascasse recorded conversations with the emperor. Napoleon dictated recollections of campaigns, discussed politics, criticized enemies, defended controversial decisions, and reflected upon his rise and fall. These discussions became the foundation of the Memorial of St. Helena. In many ways, Napoleon was writing his own verdict before posterity. He portrayed himself as a defender of the French Revolution, a champion of merit, a victim of monarchies fearful of progress. The image proved enormously influential. Millions who never saw Napoleon alive would encounter him through these pages. St. Helena became the birthplace of Napoleonic legend. Life settled into routine. Napoleon often rose late. He read extensively. History remained a particular passion. Caesar, Tacitus, Plutarch, and accounts of Alexander the Great. The emperor constantly compared his own career with those of antiquity. Hours were devoted to dictation. Secretaries recorded memoirs and military analysis. Evenings frequently extended deep into the night. Conversations ranged across every imaginable subject: government, religion, science, literature, war, and destiny itself. Visitors often remarked upon Napoleon's extraordinary memory. He could recall troop numbers, battlefield positions, and administrative details from decades earlier. The exile became a living archive of his own empire. Gradually, the household began to shrink. Lascasse was expelled from the island in late 1816 after attempting to send unauthorized correspondence. His departure deeply affected Napoleon. The monotony of exile intensified tensions. Longwood increasingly resembled a world in decline. Meanwhile, Europe moved on. Kings ruled securely, armies mobilized, new generations emerged. The man who had once dominated headlines became a distant memory.
For Napoleon, this may have been the cruelest punishment. Not imprisonment, but irrelevance.
By 1818, signs of physical deterioration became increasingly apparent. Napoleon gained weight, Exercise decreased. Long periods were spent indoors. He complained of fatigue, weakness, and persistent abdominal pain. Doctors offered differing diagnoses. Treatments varied. Nothing seemed effective. The unhealthy environment of Longwood likely worsened his condition. Damp air, limited activity, psychological stress, years of confinement, together they formed a destructive combination. Yet Napoleon remained intellectually active. He continued reading, continued dictating, continued fighting for his reputation. By early 1821, the end approached. Napoleon spent increasing amounts of time in bed. Food became difficult to tolerate, pain intensified. His companions recognized the seriousness of the situation. The emperor himself seemed aware that death was near. In April, he dictated his will. It was both a legal document and a political testament. He distributed gifts, issued final instructions, and expressed enduring loyalty to France. Outside, storms swept across St. Helena. Inside Longwood, the former master of Europe slowly faded. On the 5th of May 1821, after days of agony, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. Witnesses recorded heavy rain striking the windows of Longwood. The exile was over. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe was gone. His final words remain disputed. Several versions survive. Among the most famous are references to France, the army, and Josephine. Whatever the exact phrase, his thoughts appeared fixed upon the world he had lost. Napoleon requested burial beside a spring in a quiet valley. On the 9th of May 1821, he was laid to rest.
No imperial grandeur accompanied the ceremony. No triumphal arches, no salutes from victorious armies, only a grave upon a remote island in the South Atlantic.
Even the inscription became controversial. Disputes over titles prevented agreement. The tomb remained largely anonymous. Yet pilgrims soon began arriving. The grave of the exile became a place of remembrance and eventually of legend. St. Helena achieved what Europe's monarchs intended. Napoleon never escaped. He never returned to power. He never again commanded an army. But in another sense, the monarchs failed. Because on St. Helena, Napoleon won his final campaign through memoirs, conversations, and carefully crafted regulations. He transformed defeat into myth. The prisoner became a martyr. The emperor became a legend. In 1840, nearly 20 years after his death, France brought his remains home. The former exile was carried in triumph through Paris. Thousands lined the streets. A man once condemned as Europe's greatest threat returned as one of France's greatest heroes. His remains were laid to rest beneath the golden dome of the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris.
As the funeral procession passed, a few solitary figures emerged from the crowd. In threadbare uniforms and moth-eaten bearskins, the stupid old men would momentarily stand straight back. They presented arms with movements fluid as if the past of 25 years had fallen away, as the old guardsman, the immortal, salutes his emperor one last time.
Few individuals have shaped the modern world as profoundly as Napoleon Bonaparte. Through administrative reform, merit-based government, legal equality before the law, and the spread of nationalist ideas, he helped lay foundations that continue to influence modern states across Europe and beyond. His vision of a Europe governed by common institutions foreshadowed later movements towards European integration, while the Napoleonic civil codes became one of the most influential legal systems in history, establishing principles of property rights, secular law, and equality before the law that remain embedded in many countries today. Today, visitors to St. Helena can still walk the windswept grounds of Longwood House. They can stand in the rooms where Napoleon dictated his memories, and they can see the lonely landscapes that formed the backdrop to his final years. There, at the edge of the world, the age of Napoleon came to an end, but the legend of Napoleon began. We will bring more documentaries on Napoleonic history. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and have a great time.